The alarm on Ethan Carter's phone buzzed against the nightstand, cutting through the silence of the apartment. It was 5:30 a.m. Outside the window, the Chicago suburbs were buried in darkness. A draft seeped through the cracks in the window frame, making the small bedroom feel more like an icebox than a home. Ethan sat up and rubbed his face. His hands felt cold. He didn't want to leave the warmth of his blankets. But today was too important. He swung his legs out of bed and his feet hit the freezing floorboards. He moved quickly to the closet. Hanging there was his charcoal suit. It was old, the fabric thinning at the elbows, but it was the only one he had. He pulled out a white dress shirt. He frowned. The collar was slightly wrinkled. He carried it into the living room and set up the ironing board. The iron hissed as he pressed it against the cotton. He focused on the movement, back and forth. He needed to look professional today. He needed the promotion. The health insurance plan at his current level was barely enough to cover Lily's checkups, let alone anything serious. If he got the senior analyst spot, things would change. He hung the shirt carefully on the doorknob and went to the kitchen. He pressed the button on the coffee maker. Nothing happened. "Come on," Ethan whispered. He pressed it again. Silence. The little green light didn't turn on. The machine had finally died after 6 years of loyal service. He looked at the clock on the microwave, 5:45 a.m. He didn't have time to fix it, and he didn't have the money to buy a Starbucks on the way. He grabbed a small metal pot from the drying rack, filled it with tap water, and set it on the stove. While the water boiled, he spooned instant coffee crystals into his chipped mug. It wasn't going to taste good, but he needed the caffeine to keep his hands steady. A creak from the hallway made him turn. Lily stood there, rubbing her eyes. Her hair was a mess of curls. "It's early, Bug. Go back to sleep for 10 minutes. Lily shook her head and climbed onto a kitchen chair. "I'm hungry." Ethan turned off the stove and poured the water into his mug. He grabbed a box of Pop-Tarts from the pantry. Strawberry or cinnamon? Strawberry. He put the pastries in the toaster. The smell of sugary fruit filled the small kitchen, masking the scent of the burnt dust from the radiator. He placed the warm tart on a paper towel and slid it in front of her. "Careful, it's hot." Lily took a small bite. "Are you doing the big talk today?" "The presentation." "Yes." "Are you scared?" Ethan took a sip of the bitter coffee. "A little bit. It's a lot of people. You shouldn't be. You're smart." "Thanks, kid. Eat up. We have to leave in 20 minutes. The morning rush took over. Ethan dressed in his suit, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. The suit fit a little looser than it used to. He skipped breakfast for himself. There wasn't enough time, and his stomach was too tied up in knots anyway. He helped Lily with her backpack. She hugged him tight around the waist. "Wait," she said. She pulled a yellow pad from her pocket and scribbled something with a crayon. She stood on her tiptoes and shoved the paper into his jacket pocket. "For luck, I need all the luck I can get. Let's go." The drive to the drop-off was quiet. The heater in his 2010 Ford Taurus took forever to kick in. After dropping Lily off at school, Ethan merged onto the highway toward the city. Traffic was heavy. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his mind rehearsing the sales figures for the presentation. He reached into his pocket to check for his ID badge, and his fingers brushed against the paper Lily had hidden there. He pulled it out at a red light. It was a bright yellow post-it note. In wobbly crayon letters, it read, "Kick butt today. Daddy, you are my hero." Ethan stared at the note. A lump formed in his throat. He wasn't anyone's hero. He was a guy driving a rusting car to a job where he was barely invisible. But to her, he was something else. He carefully tucked the note back into his pocket, right against his chest. He clocked in at the Sterling retail branch with 2 minutes to spare. The office was an open-plan layout, rows of gray desks under harsh fluorescent lights. It was designed to encourage collaboration, but mostly it just made everyone loud and distracted. Ethan sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He felt the exhaustion in his bones. The instant coffee hadn't done much. He spent the morning finalizing the slides, keeping his head down. At noon, the office emptied out as people went to the nearby delis or cafes. Ethan stayed behind. He walked to the break room and pulled his lunch out of a brown paper bag. It was a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. Peanut butter and jelly. It was cheap, filling, and didn't require a microwave. He sat at the small round table in the corner and unwrapped the foil. The door swung open. Brad Halloway walked in, followed closely by Greg. Brad was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Ethan's car. He looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine ad for corporate success. Brad stopped at the vending machine, then turned and saw Ethan. A smirk spread across his face. He walked over, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum. "Hey, Carter, still on the Happy Meal menu?" Ethan didn't look up. He took a bite of his sandwich, just eating lunch. Brad clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. It was a heavy, aggressive pat. "I thought today was the $1 million presentation day. Big players eat steak, Carter. Protein for the brain." Greg snickered from the doorway, leaning against the frame. "Maybe he's saving up for a new suit. That one looks like he borrowed it from his grandpa. The lapels are huge. It's vintage, Greg. Very stylish in the 90s, Brad said. Ethan chewed slowly. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell Brad to back off, to tell him that he was working twice as hard for half the credit. But he couldn't. Brad was the sales director. One complaint from him, and the presentation wouldn't matter. "Good luck today, buddy," Brad said, squeezing Ethan's shoulder one last time before letting go. "Try not to sweat through that shirt. It looks thin." They walked out, laughing about weekend plans in the Gold Coast. Ethan sat alone in the break room. The silence returned, but the air felt heavy. He put the half-eaten sandwich down. He had lost his appetite. His hand went to his jacket pocket again. He traced the edge of the yellow post-it note with his thumb. "Kick butt today, Daddy." He took a deep breath, wrapped the sandwich back up, and stood. He had work to do. Ethan checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes as he hurried out of the break room, grabbing his car keys. He had left the branch office with just enough time to make it downtown, provided the Chicago traffic gods were merciful. He tapped his chest pocket once more, feeling the crinkle of Lily's yellow note against his ribs, and stepped out into the gray afternoon. He merged his rattling Ford Taurus onto the I-90 ramp, the tires humming against the asphalt. The sky above Chicago had turned a bruised purple color, heavy and low. Within minutes, the clouds opened up. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. Water hammered against the windshield, and his wipers squeaked frantically back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tight. He couldn't afford an accident today. This presentation wasn't just about a title bump. It was about the PPO health plan that came with the senior analyst role. Lily needed an inhaler refill next week, and the deductible on his current plan was eating him alive. He needed this win. Traffic slowed to a crawl. Red brake lights stretched out ahead of him like a ribbon of blood. He was making decent time, but his nerves were frayed. Then he saw it. About 100 yards ahead, pulled onto the narrow shoulder, was a massive black Mercedes G-Wagon. Its hazard lights were blinking rapidly, cutting through the gloom. As Ethan crept closer in the slow lane, he saw a figure standing outside the vehicle. It was a woman. She was soaked. Most people were driving past, splashing water onto her legs as they sped up to get out of the storm. Ethan looked at the dashboard clock. He had a 20-minute buffer. If he stopped, he would burn through all of it. He should keep driving. He really should keep driving. He looked back at the woman. She was holding a phone to her ear, standing in a puddle. She turned slightly, and Ethan saw the unmistakable curve of a pregnancy bump beneath her drenched coat. "Damn it," Ethan whispered. He put on his blinker and swerved onto the shoulder, pulling up behind the G-Wagon. The rain was freezing, a sharp reminder that winter was just around the corner. Ethan took a deep breath, popped his hood just to be safe, and stepped out. The cold wind hit him like a physical blow, instantly soaking his hair. He walked toward the woman. She didn't wave. She didn't look relieved. She was pacing a tight circle by the rear tire, screaming into a headset. "I don't care about the reason. I don't care if the server is down." She paused, listening to someone on the other end. Her face twisted in anger. "If that file isn't on my desk in 10 minutes, you're fired. Do you understand me? Pack your box." She tapped the headset off aggressively. She turned and finally noticed Ethan standing there. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing. In Chicago, a stranger walking up to you on the highway wasn't usually a good thing. She looked at his old car, then at his cheap suit. She rolled the window up, leaving just a crack open, even though she was standing outside. It was a reflex. "What do you want?" Ethan wiped rain from his eyes. "I saw you pulled over. I saw the flat tire. I can help." Victoria looked at him, then down at her rear tire. It was shredded. She looked back at him, sizing him up. There was no gratitude in her eyes, just calculation. AAA says they are 45 minutes out. They're backed up because of the storm. I can do it faster than that. Can you? I have a meeting in 30 minutes. I cannot be late. I can get you back on the road in 10. Fine. Do it. She didn't say please. She didn't ask his name. She simply opened the driver's door and climbed back into the dry leather interior of her SUV, slamming the door shut to escape the noise of the highway. Ethan stood there for a second, blinking against the rain. Then he moved. He knelt in the mud beside the rear tire. The water on the ground was freezing, soaking instantly through the knees of his trousers. He grabbed the jack from the G-Wagon's trunk. It was heavy, much heavier than the one in his Ford. The wind whipped against his face, stinging his skin. The temperature had dropped to near 40 degrees. His fingers were numb as he fumbled with the lug nuts. They were tight, machine-tightened. He had to put his entire body weight onto the tire iron to get them to budge. Inside the car, he could see Victoria. The interior light was on. She was on another call. She was gesturing wildly with one hand, looking at a tablet on her lap. Every 30 seconds, she would glance at her diamond-encrusted watch, then look out the rear window at Ethan with a scowl, as if willing him to work faster. Ethan gritted his teeth. His white shirt was plastered to his skin. His tie was ruined. He shivered violently as he cranked the jack, lifting the heavy beast of a car off the asphalt. "Come on," he muttered to himself. "Do it for the baby. Just do it for the baby." He wrestled the spare tire into place. His hands were shaking so bad he dropped a lug nut into a puddle and had to fish it out with freezing fingers. He tightened everything down, his muscles screaming in protest. He lowered the car. Done. Ethan threw the flat tire into the trunk and slammed it shut. He walked to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. Victoria ended her call and opened the door. She stepped out to inspect the work. The wind had picked up, howling across the open highway. A gust of icy rain swirled around the car door. Without thinking, Ethan took off his suit jacket. It was wet on the outside, but the lining was still somewhat dry. He held it up, creating a shield between Victoria and the biting wind. "Careful," he said, his voice shaking from the cold. "It's slippery out here. Don't let the baby get cold." Victoria stopped. She looked at the tire. Then she looked at the jacket held over her head. She looked at Ethan. He was shivering, his shirt transparent from the rain, his lips turning a pale shade of blue. For a second, the hard line of her jaw softened. She looked confused, as if she had just heard a language she didn't speak. "The tire is solid," Ethan said, teeth chattering. "But get it checked at a shop. That spare isn't meant for long distances." Victoria blinked, shaking off the moment. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a thick clip of cash. She didn't count it. She just pulled out a wad of $100 bills. "Here." She held it out to him. It was more money than Ethan made in 2 weeks. He looked at the cash, then at her face. "No," Ethan said. He pushed her hand gently back toward her purse. "Keep it. Go buy yourself a hot chocolate or something warm." He checked his own watch and his stomach dropped. He was going to be late. "I have to go," he said. He turned and sprinted back to his Ford Taurus, splashing through the puddles. He jumped in, cranked the engine, and merged back into traffic without looking back. Victoria stood alone on the side of the road. The rain was still falling, but the jacket had blocked the worst of the wind for those few seconds. She looked at the money in her hand, then looked down at the wet pavement, lying in a puddle, right where Ethan had been standing, was a soggy, rectangular piece of cardstock. She bent down and picked it up. It was a business card. The ink was running, blurring the logo of the Sterling retail branch, but the name was still legible. Ethan Carter, analyst. Victoria stared at the card. She looked at the retreating taillights of the beat-up Ford Taurus disappearing into the storm. She gripped the card tightly, got back into her warm car, and tossed the cash onto the passenger seat. She put the car in drive, her expression unreadable as she merged onto the highway. Ethan pushed his Ford Taurus to its limit, the engine whining in protest as he sped away from the woman on the highway. He parked crookedly in the back lot of the Sterling branch office and sprinted toward the glass doors, his wet shoes squelching with every step. He ignored the startled look of the receptionist as he bypassed the sign-in sheet and practically ran to the elevators, hammering the button for the third floor. He checked his watch. 25 minutes late, the elevator doors slid open, and Ethan stepped into the hallway. He could see the main conference room at the end of the corridor. It was a fishbowl, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Inside, the entire senior management team was seated around the long mahogany table. Ethan took a breath, tried to smooth down his soaked hair, and grabbed the door handle. He pushed it open. The room was dead silent. The air conditioning was blasting, instantly turning the rainwater on his skin into ice. As he stepped onto the plush gray carpet, a puddle formed around his shoes. Brad Holloway was standing at the front of the room, holding the laser pointer. On the screen behind him were Ethan's slides, the projections he had spent weeks building. Brad had started without him. Brad stopped mid-sentence. He slowly turned his head to look at Ethan. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. 12 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the man dripping dirty rainwater onto the floor. Brad lowered the pointer. He looked Ethan up and down with a look of pure disgust, then turned his gaze to the regional vice president seated at the far end. "Ladies and gentlemen, look at this," Brad said, gesturing toward Ethan like he was a stain on the wall. "Here is the reason why our quarterly sales dropped. This right here. The lack of professionalism." Ethan stepped forward, his hand gripping his briefcase tight. "Brad, I apologize. I'm sorry I'm late." "Late?" Brad laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You aren't just late, Carter. You look like you took a swim in the Chicago River." "There was an emergency on the highway," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "A situation came up." "A situation?" "Yes. A woman was stranded. I stopped to help." Brad shook his head, cutting him off. "Let me guess. Your cat got sick? Or did your daughter forget her lunchbox again? I am sick and tired of your excuses, Carter. Every week it's something else with you. A school play, a doctor's appointment, a flat tire. This wasn't an excuse. It was a crisis." "No, this is a crisis," Brad said, pointing at the screen. "These numbers are a crisis. You are just a liability." Ethan looked around the room. He saw faces he had worked with for 5 years, people he had shared coffee with, people whose birthdays he knew. None of them met his eyes. They all looked down at their notepads or tablets, terrified to draw Brad's fire. "I can do the presentation," Ethan said. "I know the data. These are my slides." "They were your slides," Brad corrected. "Now they belong to the department. And the department doesn't need someone who prioritizes playing mechanic in the rain over $1 million account." Brad took a step closer to Ethan. He loomed over him, clean, dry, and smelling of expensive cologne. "We need commitment in this branch. We need people who put this company first, always." "I do put this company first," Ethan said, but his voice lacked force. He was shivering now. "Clearly not," Brad snapped. He pointed a finger toward the glass door. "Get out. You're done." The words hung in the air. Ethan blinked. "What? You heard me. You're fired. Effective immediately." "You can't do that. I have rights. I can do whatever I want." "You missed the biggest meeting of the year. You walked in here looking like a vagrant. It's cause for termination. Now get out before I have you thrown out." Brad didn't wait for a response. He turned to Greg, who was sitting near the door, a smirk playing on his lips. "Greg, call security. Escort Mr. Carter to his desk. Make sure he doesn't steal a stapler on his way out." "On it, boss," Greg said, pulling out his phone. Ethan stood there for a second longer. He felt dizzy. The room seemed to tilt. He looked at the vice president, hoping for someone to intervene, to say this was too harsh. The VP just tapped his pen on the table and looked at his watch, annoyed by the interruption. Ethan turned around. He walked out of the conference room, leaving a trail of wet footprints behind him. 2 security guards met him at his cubicle. They stood with their arms crossed, watching as he pulled a small cardboard box from under his desk. Ethan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip his things. He didn't take much. He left the files, the notebooks, the pens. He grabbed his coffee mug. He grabbed a small potted succulent that was half dead. Then he reached for the corkboard. He unpinned the drawing Lily had made for him last Father's Day. It was a crayon picture of him with giant muscles and a cape. He placed it gently on top of the mug in the box. "Let's go, Carter," one of the guards said. "We don't have all day." Ethan walked through the open-plan office. He could feel the eyes of the junior analysts on him. They whispered behind their hands. He kept his head down, staring at his wet shoes. He walked past the break room where he had eaten his peanut butter sandwich just hours ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed. The guards walked him to the front doors and watched him step out into the rain. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it was colder now. Ethan walked to his car. He threw the box onto the passenger seat. He climbed in and slammed the door, shutting out the noise of the wind. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there. The cold from his wet clothes seeped into his bones. He gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. He had no job. He had no insurance. Rent was due in 6 days. He thought about Lily. He thought about her note. "Kick butt today, Daddy." He rested his forehead against the freezing plastic of the steering wheel. He didn't cry. He was too shocked to cry. He just sat there, shivering uncontrollably, while the rain washed over the car, blurring the world outside until everything was just gray. The numbness of the long drive home in the rain had eventually faded, replaced by a sharp, gnawing anxiety that kept Ethan awake all night. Now, sitting at his small kitchen table the next morning, the silence of the apartment felt heavier than the storm ever had. Ethan stared at the notebook open in front of him. A calculator sat next to his cold cup of coffee. He punched the numbers in again, hoping the math would change. It didn't. Rent was $1,200. Utilities were another $200. Lily's asthma medication was coming up for a refill, and without the company insurance plan, that was $300 out of pocket. He had 2 weeks of severance pay coming, maybe. After that, nothing. He rubbed his temples. He could apply for unemployment, but that would take weeks to process, and it wouldn't be enough to cover the rent. He looked around the small living room. He could sell the TV, maybe pawn his watch. It would buy them a week of groceries. But then what? The phone buzz on the table made him jump. He looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, with a local area code. He hesitated. It was probably a bill collector already. Or maybe HR calling to tell him he forgot to sign a form. He swiped to answer. "Hello? Ethan Carter?" The voice was female, sharp and icy. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it immediately. Speaking. "Who is this?" "This is Victoria Sterling." Ethan froze. "The woman from the highway, the woman with the G-Wagon." "Oh, hi. You left your wallet in the jacket you gave me," she said. Her tone was flat, like she was reading a grocery list. "I found it this morning." Ethan patted his back pocket instinctively. Empty. In his rush to get away and his panic about being late, he hadn't even realized he'd left his wallet in the suit jacket he'd draped over her. "Right. I didn't realize. Look, you can just mail it to the address on the license. I can't really drive out. I am at my residence in the Gold Coast. Come pick it up. I'll leave your name at the front desk. Miss Sterling, I really don't have time to 1500 North Lakeshore Drive, the penthouse. Don't be late." The line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone. He let out a frustrated sigh. He needed that wallet. His driver's license and his only debit card were in there. He didn't have the money for gas to drive downtown and back, but he didn't have a choice. He grabbed his keys and headed out to the Ford. The drive to the Gold Coast took 40 minutes. The transition was jarring. He left the cracked sidewalks and gray siding of his neighborhood and entered a world of glass, steel, and manicured landscaping. He pulled his rusting Taurus up to the entrance of the massive glass tower. A valet in a uniform that cost more than Ethan's car stepped forward, looking skeptical. "I'm here to see Victoria Sterling," Ethan said, rolling down the window. The valet checked a clipboard. He looked surprised. "Name? Ethan Carter. Go right in. Elevators are to the left." Ethan parked the car himself around the corner to avoid the valet charge and walked back. The lobby smelled like expensive perfume and money. He took the elevator to the top floor, his stomach twisting. He just wanted his wallet. He just wanted to get this over with and go back to figuring out how to survive. The elevator doors opened directly into the apartment. Ethan stepped out. The space was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, gray and churning. The furniture was sleek, modern, and white. It looked like a page out of a design magazine, pristine and untouched. It was freezing. Victoria was sitting on a velvet sofa in the middle of the room. She was wearing a silk robe, looking pale and exhausted. A laptop was open on the coffee table in front of her, along with stacks of paper. She didn't look up when he walked in. "Close the door. The draft is annoying." Ethan pressed the button to close the elevator. "Miss Sterling, I'm here for the wallet." Victoria reached next to her and picked up his worn leather billfold. She tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a soft thud. "I did a background check on you this morning," she said, finally looking at him. Ethan bristled. "You what?" "I wanted to know who stopped on the highway. People don't usually stop." She tapped a finger on her laptop. "I made a few calls. I heard you got fired yesterday." Ethan felt his face get hot. The shame of the public execution in the conference room washed over him again. "News travels fast," he said, his voice tight. "Did you call just to rub it in? I heard the sales director fired you for being late. 25 minutes late." "Yeah, well, actions have consequences. I learned that the hard way." Ethan walked over and grabbed his wallet. "Thanks for returning this. If you're done checking up on my life, I'm going to go." "Sit down, Ethan." "No thanks. I have to go find a job." I said, "Sit down." There was command in her voice, the kind that was used to being obeyed. Ethan stopped. He shouldn't listen to her. She was part of the reason he was in this mess. But he was tired, and he had nothing to rush home to but anxiety. He sat on the edge of a white armchair, ready to bolt. "My driver quit this morning," Victoria said, looking out the window at the gray sky. "He said I was too demanding. My housekeeper gave notice last week because she said the apartment was too big to manage alone." "Sounds like you have a staffing problem," Ethan said. "Sorry to hear that. I don't like people, Ethan. They are noisy. They are nosy. They want to be friends, or they want to steal from you." She turned her gaze back to him. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You didn't take the money yesterday. I offered you a stack of cash, and you told me to buy hot chocolate. I didn't do it for the money." "I know. That makes you rare. Or stupid." "I haven't decided yet." Ethan stood up. "I'm going with stupid. Have a nice life, Miss Sterling." "I need a house manager," she said, talking over him. "Someone to drive me to meetings, because I can't fit behind the wheel anymore. Someone to make sure the fridge is stocked and the cleaners actually clean. Someone safe. Someone silent. Someone who isn't greedy." Ethan paused. "I'm an analyst, Miss Sterling. I work with data. I'm not a butler. You were an analyst. Now you are unemployed with a daughter who I assume needs health insurance." Ethan flinched. She had dug deep. "This is inappropriate," he said. "The pay is $80,000 a year," Victoria said calmly. "Plus full medical, dental, and vision. Effective immediately. No probation period." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. 80,000. That was nearly double what he was making at the branch. It would cover the rent, the debts, the inhalers, everything. "You want me to be your servant," Ethan said quietly. "I want you to manage my life because I am currently unable to do it myself," she corrected. She gestured to her stomach. "I am tired, Ethan. I have a company to run, and I don't have the energy to interview strangers who might sell stories about me to the tabloids. You are already vetted, you are honest, and you need money." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It is a job. Do you want it or not?" Ethan looked at the sleek, cold apartment. He looked at the woman who seemed to view human interaction as a transaction. It was a step down. It was humiliating, in a way. He would be carrying bags and driving a car instead of building spreadsheets. But then he thought about Lily. He thought about the broken coffee maker and the drafty windows in his apartment. He thought about the fear of not being able to pay for her medicine. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. He gripped his wallet tight in his hand. "Full benefits?" he asked. "Full benefits, and a signing bonus." Ethan took a breath. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "When do I start?" "Right now," Victoria said, turning back to her laptop. "Go to the kitchen. The coffee machine is confusing, and I need a cup. Black." Ethan stood in front of the chrome espresso machine in Victoria's kitchen, staring at the digital display. It had more buttons than his first car. After 2 failed attempts that resulted in nothing but steam and a puddle of hot water, he finally managed to produce a cup of black coffee. He placed it on a coaster beside Victoria's laptop, retreated to the corner, and waited for his next instruction. That was the beginning of the strangest 2 weeks of Ethan's life. His days fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and incredibly boring. He arrived at the penthouse at 7 a.m. sharp. He checked the refrigerator. It had to be stocked with exactly 12 glass bottles of Voss water, facing forward, labels aligned. If there were 11, he had to go to the storage pantry and replace one. If the pantry was low, he had to go to Whole Foods. Then came the driving. Victoria didn't like to talk in the car. She sat in the back of the G-Wagon, the very car he had changed the tire on, and conducted conference calls from the moment the engine started until he put it in park at the Sterling Global headquarters. Ethan learned to drive like a ghost, smooth stops, gentle turns, eyes always on the road, never in the rearview mirror. He learned things about her from the silence. He learned that she was terrifyingly efficient. He learned that she could shred a marketing director's proposal with 3 sentences. And he learned that she was completely, utterly alone. One Tuesday evening, around 7:30 p.m., Ethan was in the kitchen wiping down the marble countertops. He was supposed to clock out at 6, but Victoria had asked him to wait for a courier package. He looked out into the living room. Victoria was sitting at the dining table. It was a table meant for 10 people, but she occupied just one corner. A container of takeout sushi sat open next to her. She was typing furiously with one hand and eating a piece of tuna with the other, her eyes never leaving the screen. The apartment was silent except for the clicking of keys. No music, no TV, no phone calls to friends, no family checking in on the pregnant woman living in a glass tower. Ethan walked over, clearing his throat to announce his presence. "Miss Sterling?" Victoria didn't look up. "Did the package arrive?" "Yes. It's on the entryway table. Is there anything else you need before I head home?" "No. Be here at 6:45 tomorrow. I have a breakfast meeting." Ethan hesitated. He looked at the half-eaten sushi. "Do you want me to put the rest of that in the fridge? Or maybe get you some water? I can manage a water bottle." "Ethan, go home." "Right. Good night." He walked to the elevator, pressing the button. As the doors slid shut, he caught one last glimpse of her. She had stopped typing. She was just staring out the window at the dark city lights, one hand resting absently on her stomach. She looked small against the vastness of the empty room. The following Thursday, the weather turned. A cold front blew off Lake Michigan, dropping temperatures into the 30s. The penthouse, with all its glass, felt like a refrigerator. Ethan stayed late again. Victoria had a board meeting the next day and was reviewing quarterly reports. He sat in the kitchen, organizing invoices for the household expenses, waiting to be dismissed. Around 10 p.m., the typing stopped. Ethan waited 10 minutes. Usually, she would call out for him to lock up. When silence stretched to 20 minutes, he stood up and walked quietly into the living room. Victoria was asleep on the white velvet sofa. She had collapsed sideways, her legs tucked up as best she could with a baby bump. Her head was resting on the armrest at an awkward angle. A stack of spreadsheets was teetering on her lap, threatening to slide onto the floor. Her phone was still clutched loosely in her right hand. Ethan approached slowly. Asleep, the sharp edges of her face seemed to soften. She didn't look like the CEO who terrified her employees. She just looked like a tired mother. He gently reached out and took the papers from her lap, setting them on the coffee table. She didn't stir. She let out a soft sigh, shivering slightly. The thermostat on the wall read 68 degrees. It was freezing. Ethan looked around. There were no blankets in the living room. It was a showroom, not a living space. He walked to the linen closet in the hallway, found a thick gray cashmere throw, and brought it back. He unfolded it carefully. He didn't want to wake her. He knew if she woke up and found him standing over her, she'd probably fire him on the spot for invading her personal space. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, tucking it around her feet. She shifted, burrowing her face into the warmth of the cashmere. Ethan walked to the wall panel. He bumped the thermostat up to 74 degrees. Then he moved around the room, turning off the recessed lights until only the soft glow of the city remained. He let himself out, locking the door silently behind him. The next morning, Ethan arrived at 6:45 a.m. He braced himself. He didn't know if she would remember the blanket or if she would be angry that he had stayed so late. He entered the penthouse. The blanket was folded neatly on the arm of the sofa. The papers were back in her briefcase. Victoria was in the kitchen, standing by the island, drinking tea. She was wearing a sharp gray suit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. The armor was back on. Ethan walked in, placing his keys in the drawer. "Good morning, Miss Sterling." Victoria blew on her tea. She didn't turn around. "Who told you to touch the thermostat?" Ethan paused. "I did. It was cold in here last night. I like it cold. It keeps me awake. It was 30 degrees outside, and you were sleeping on the couch without a blanket. I didn't want you to get sick." Victoria turned slowly. She leaned against the counter, holding the mug with both hands. She scrutinized him, her eyes searching for something, maybe pity, maybe condescension. "I don't pay you to be a nurse, Ethan. I pay you to manage the house. Managing the house includes managing the temperature and making sure the owner doesn't freeze." He expected her to snap at him. He expected a lecture on boundaries. Instead, she took a sip of tea. She looked over the rim of the mug at him. The hard, angry glare that usually greeted him wasn't there. Her eyes were tired, yes, but the steeliness had cracked just a fraction. "74 is too hot," she said finally. "Keep it at 72. Understood. 72. And the car needs gas. We're leaving in 10 minutes. I filled it up yesterday afternoon. It's ready." Victoria lowered the mug. She looked at the folded blanket on the sofa in the other room, then back at Ethan. "Fine," she said. "Let's go." She walked past him toward the elevator. She didn't say thank you. She didn't acknowledge the kindness. But as the elevator doors closed, Ethan saw her pull her coat tighter around herself, as if she was still holding onto the warmth he had left her. The truce over the thermostat had settled into a fragile routine. Victoria didn't thank him for the blanket, and Ethan didn't bring it up. But the temperature in the penthouse stayed at a steady 72 degrees. The mornings were still silent, the car rides still strictly business, but the hostility had dialed back from a boil to a simmer. That Tuesday, however, the routine broke. Victoria woke up pale and sluggish, her ankles swollen. She refused to go to the hospital but agreed to stay home. The problem was the quarterly sales review. It couldn't be rescheduled. "Have them come here," Victoria told Ethan, pressing a cold compress to her forehead. "Holloway and his assistant. Set up the dining table. And make sure there is coffee, strong." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. Brad Holloway. He hadn't seen his former boss since the public firing in the glass conference room. He considered calling in sick, hiding in the kitchen, or just leaving the tray at the door. But he needed this job. He needed the insurance. At 10 a.m., the elevator chimed. Ethan straightened his tie. He was wearing the uniform. Victoria requested black slacks and a crisp white shirt, no jacket. He opened the door. Brad Holloway stepped out, followed closely by Greg. They both stopped dead in their tracks. Their eyes swept over the floor to ceiling windows, the white velvet furniture, and the sheer expanse of the Gold Coast skyline. "Wow," Greg whispered. "This place is insane." Brad adjusted his suit jacket, putting on his best, sycophantic smile. "Pull yourself together, Greg. Act like you've been somewhere before." Victoria was already seated at the head of the dining table, her laptop open. She didn't stand up. She looked impatient. "Gentlemen, you're late." "Traffic on Lakeshore Drive was a nightmare, Miss Sterling," Brad said, walking over with his hand extended. "But thank you for having us. Your home is absolutely stunning. Truly a testament to your success." Victoria ignored his hand. "Sit. I want to see the Q3 projections. I don't have all day." Brad cleared his throat, slightly embarrassed, and sat down. Greg scrambled to set up his tablet. They were nervous. Ethan could see the sweat beading on Greg's forehead. Ethan stayed in the kitchen for the first 10 minutes, listening to Brad spin numbers and make excuses for missed targets. It was the same song and dance Ethan had listened to for 5 years. Finally, Victoria signaled for refreshments. Ethan took a deep breath. He picked up the silver tray with the coffee pot, cups, and sugar bowl. He walked into the dining area. He approached the table from Brad's left. "Coffee?" Ethan asked quietly. Brad was mid-sentence about market volatility. He turned annoyed at the interruption, ready to dismiss the help. Then he saw the face. Brad froze. His mouth hung open for a second. "Carter?" Greg looked up from his tablet and snorted. "No way." Ethan kept his face neutral. "Hello, Brad." "Greg, cream or sugar?" Brad swiveled in his chair, a cruel grin spreading across his face. The tension he felt from Victoria seemed to evaporate, replaced by the delight of finding a punching bag. "I don't believe it," Brad laughed, looking from Ethan to Victoria. "Miss Sterling, you hired this guy? I thought you were joking, Carter. I thought when you walked out with your little box, you were going to go deliver pizzas." "I manage the household," Ethan said, pouring the coffee with a steady hand. "Household manager," Greg echoed. "That's a fancy word for a maid, isn't it?" "It's honest work," Ethan said. "Honest?" Brad shook his head. "Miss Sterling, you have to watch this one. He's not just incompetent. He's desperate. Better count the silverware before you go to bed. He might try to pawn a fork to pay his rent." Victoria was watching them. She hadn't moved. Her eyes darted from Brad's sneering face to Ethan's rigid posture. She saw the way Ethan's jaw clenched, the way he focused entirely on the coffee pot to avoid looking at them. Brad wasn't done. He was enjoying the audience. He reached out for his cup as Ethan placed it down. "Careful there, Jeeves," Brad said. As Ethan pulled his hand back, Brad deliberately jerked his arm. His elbow knocked into Ethan's wrist. The silver spoon on the saucer clattered loudly onto the marble floor. Coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the white saucer. "Oops," Brad said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Clumsy hands, Carter. Always dropping the ball, aren't you?" He pointed at the spoon on the floor. "Pick it up, serving boy, and get me a clean saucer. I don't want stains on my clothes." The room went silent. Ethan stood there. His face burned. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to throw the pot of hot coffee into Brad's lap. He wanted to tell him to go to hell. He wanted to walk out. But then he thought of Lily. He thought of the inhaler on her nightstand. He thought of the $80,000 in the security had bought. Ethan slowly bent his knees. He reached down to the cold floor and picked up the silver spoon. "I'll get a fresh cup," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. He straightened up. He didn't look at Brad. He turned to walk back to the kitchen. "That is enough." The voice cut through the air like a whip. It wasn't loud, but it was freezing cold. Victoria was staring at Brad. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't amused. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. Brad chuckled nervously. "Oh, don't worry, Miss Sterling. We go way back. Just a little hazing for the old times. You know how it is." "No," Victoria said. "I don't know how it is." She closed her laptop with a snap. She looked at Brad. Then she looked at Ethan's retreating back. She saw the humiliation in his shoulders. She saw a man swallowing his pride to provide for someone else. And then she looked at Brad, a man in a $3,000 suit who felt big by making someone else feel small. "Brad," Victoria said, her voice dangerously low, "if you have time to mock my staff, you must have too much free time on your hands. Perhaps you aren't busy enough with your sales targets." Brad's smile faltered. No, of course not. We're working very hard. Are you?" Victoria leaned forward, because from where I sit, you look like a bully with mediocre numbers, and I don't tolerate either. Brad swallowed hard. "Miss Sterling, I was just—" "If you ever speak to him like that again," Victoria interrupted, "or if you ever treat anyone in this building with that kind of disrespect, the next person delivering pizzas will be you. Do you understand me?" Brad paled. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Good. Now sit down and shut up. Greg, pull up the spreadsheet. I want to see the real numbers, not the fairy tale Brad is trying to sell me." Ethan stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the silver tray trembling slightly in his hands. He looked back at the dining table. Victoria wasn't looking at him. She was already drilling Greg on the data, her face a mask of professional intensity. But she had spoken up. She had drawn a line. For the first time since the rainstorm, Ethan didn't just feel like an employee or a charity case. He felt like a human being. He took a deep breath, wiped a spot of coffee from the tray, and realized that the ice fortress might not be as impenetrable as he thought. The truce established in the dining room had made the weekdays bearable, but Ethan knew his position in the penthouse was still fragile. That fragility was tested at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. Ethan was already dressed, coffee in hand, when his phone rang. It was Mrs. Higgins. Her voice was raspy, barely a whisper. She had the flu, a bad one, and couldn't get out of bed, let alone watch an energetic 7-year-old. Ethan hung up and looked at Lily, who was still asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. He couldn't call out of work. Victoria had a schedule full of international calls that needed to be managed. He had no backup. He dialed Victoria's number, his thumb hovering over the call button for a long second. "This is Sterling," she answered on the second ring. "Miss Sterling, it's Ethan. I have a situation. I don't like situations on Saturdays, Ethan. My sitter is sick. I can't leave my daughter alone. I can come in, but I have to bring her with me." Silence stretched on the line. "Is she loud?" Victoria asked. "She's 7. She brings her coloring books. You won't know she's there." "Fine. But if she breaks anything, it comes out of your paycheck. And keep her out of my office." The drive to the Gold Coast felt longer than usual. Lily was excited about seeing the Sky House, but Ethan was sweating. When they stepped off the elevator, the penthouse was quiet. Victoria was standing in the living room reviewing a stack of contracts. She looked up, her eyes scanning Lily from her light-up sneakers to her pink backpack. "Hello," Lily said, waving a small hand. Victoria nodded stiffly. "Don't touch the white couches, don't run in the hallway, and don't touch the glass sculptures." "I won't," Lily promised. Ethan set Lily up at the far end of the kitchen island. He gave her a stack of paper and her box of crayons. "Draw quietly, Bug. Daddy has to work." The morning passed surprisingly well. Ethan managed Victoria's calls, printed documents, and kept the coffee coming. Lily stayed in her corner, tongue sticking out in concentration as she drew. Around noon, Victoria walked into the kitchen to refill her water glass. She moved slower today, her hand resting on her lower back. She paused when she saw Lily staring at her. "What are you looking at?" Victoria asked, not unkindly, just weary. Lily held up a piece of paper. It was a drawing of a woman in a blue dress with a silver crown. Inside the woman's stomach was a small yellow circle. "It's you," Lily said. Victoria took the paper. She stared at the crayon lines. "Why am I blue?" "Because you're the Snow Queen." Ethan froze by the refrigerator. He started to move forward to intervene, to apologize. But Lily kept talking. "Daddy said you aren't mean," Lily explained matter-of-factly. "He said you just have to be cold on the outside so you can keep the baby warm and safe on the inside. Like an igloo." Victoria went still. She looked from the drawing to the little girl, and then her eyes shifted to Ethan. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, his face flushing. "I was trying to explain why." Why I have to be quiet sometimes. Victoria looked back at the drawing. Her thumb traced the yellow circle in the tummy. For a moment, her expression crumbled, the hard lines of her face softening into something vulnerable. An igloo, she whispered. That's creative. She handed the drawing back to Lily. Thank you. It's a nice picture. She turned and walked back to her office, but she forgot to fill her water glass. By 6 p.m., the winter dark had settled over Chicago. The wind whipped against the glass walls, making the apartment feel even colder than usual. Normally, Ethan would order Thai food or sushi for Victoria, but tonight, the thought of cold takeout felt wrong. He checked the pantry. Flour, butter, onions, carrots. There was leftover roasted chicken in the fridge from a salad earlier in the week. What are you doing? Lily asked, watching him chop vegetables. Making dinner. Real dinner. Ethan worked quickly. He made a simple dough, rolling it out on the marble counter. He sautéed the vegetables in butter, adding flour and chicken stock to make a thick, creamy sauce. He poured the filling into a baking dish and laid the crust over the top, cutting vents in the center. 40 minutes later, the smell hit the air. It was the smell of thyme, baked pastry, and comfort. It filled the sterile, white space, chasing away the chill. Victoria emerged from her office. She stopped, sniffing the air. She looked confused, as if she had walked into the wrong apartment. What is that smell? Chicken pot pie, Ethan said, pulling the dish from the oven. Steam rose up in a thick cloud. My mom's recipe. I thought, well, it's cold out. He set 3 plates on the kitchen island. He didn't ask if she wanted some. He just served a slice for Lily, a slice for himself, and a slice for her. Dinner is ready, miss. Sterling, Ethan said. Victoria walked over. She looked at the steaming plate. The crust was golden brown and flaky. She looked at her usual spot at the dining table, empty and lonely, and then at the stools by the island where Lily was already blowing on a spoonful of carrots. Victoria pulled out a stool and sat down. She took a bite. She closed her eyes for a second. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't Michelin-star cuisine like she usually ate at business dinners. It was hot, salty, and rich. It tasted like a home. It's good, she said quietly. Thanks, Ethan said, sitting opposite her. For a while, the only sound was forks hitting plates. Ethan helped Lily cut her chicken. He wiped a smudge of gravy off her chin with a napkin. He made her drink her milk. Victoria watched them. She watched the way Ethan instinctively knew what his daughter needed before she asked. She watched the easy way they smiled at each other. She put her fork down, her appetite suddenly replaced by a heavy ache in her chest. Is it hard? She asked suddenly. Ethan looked up. Is what hard? Doing it alone. Being a dad. Ethan wiped his mouth. He looked at Lily, who was busy trying to fish a pea out of her sauce. Yeah, it's really hard, Ethan admitted. Some nights I'm terrified I'm messing it all up. I worry about money, about school, about her getting sick. It's a lot of pressure. But you do it, Victoria said. You show up. I have to. She's my kid. She's the best thing I have. Victoria looked down at her own swollen stomach. Her hand rested there, protective. I'm scared, she confessed. Her voice was so low Ethan almost didn't hear it. I have a board of directors, 1,000 employees, and millions of dollars, but I don't know how to do that. She gestured to Lily. I don't know how to be a parent. You learn, Ethan said gently. You just take it one day at a time, and you realize that you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be there. I don't have anyone to be there with me. You have people, Ethan said. You just have to let them in. Victoria looked at him. The ice fortress was still standing, but the drawbridge was lowering, just a few inches. Can I have seconds? She asked. Ethan smiled, a genuine, warm smile. He picked up the serving spoon. Coming right up, the warmth of the chicken pot pie dinner had settled into a quiet, unspoken understanding between them. But outside the penthouse walls, Chicago was proving less forgiving. A month had passed since that evening. It was now late November, and the city was disappearing under a white sheet. A blizzard had rolled in off Lake Michigan, burying the streets in snow and turning the wind into a howling beast that rattled even the thick glass of the penthouse windows. It was 11:30 p.m. Ethan was downstairs in the small staff suite Victoria had insisted he use during bad weather to avoid the dangerous commute. He was just turning off his reading lamp when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He frowned. It was the internal line. He answered immediately. "Miss Sterling?" "Ethan." Her voice was wrong. It wasn't the sharp, commanding tone he was used to. It was tight, breathless, and small. Can you come up? Please. I'm on my way." Ethan didn't bother with shoes. He sprinted out of the room and into the service elevator, hitting the button for the penthouse level. His heart hammered against his ribs. Victoria never asked for help, and she certainly never said please with that kind of desperation. The elevator doors opened, and the apartment was dark, save for the glow of the laptop still open on the dining table. "Victoria? In here, the living room." Ethan rushed in. Victoria was sitting on the edge of the white sofa, doubled over, clutching her stomach. Her face was gray, slick with sweat, despite the chill of the storm outside. She was rocking back and forth slightly, her knuckles white where she gripped the cushions. Ethan dropped to his knees in front of her. "What is it? What's happening? It hurts." "God, it hurts," she gasped, squeezing her eyes shut. "It feels like it's too early. I'm only 7 months. It's too early, Ethan." Okay. Look at me." She shook her head, staring at the floor, panic seizing her breathing. "I can't lose him. I can't do this." Ethan reached out and took her hands. They were ice cold. He pulled them away from the cushion and held them firmly in his own. His hands were rough, calloused from years of work, but they were steady. "Victoria, look at me." She finally lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror he had never seen in her. "Is it the baby?" "I think so. It's tightening. Everything is tightening. We need to time it. When did it start? Maybe 10 minutes ago?" "I don't know. I was working, and then it just grabbed me." She flinched, letting out a sharp cry as another wave of pain hit. She tried to pull away, to curl into a ball, but Ethan held onto her hands. "Don't pull away. Squeeze my hand. As hard as you can. It hurts. I know. Breathe with me, like we talked about. Come on. I can't." "Yes, you can. Watch me." In through the nose. Ethan exaggerated the breath, filling his lungs. Out through the mouth. Victoria stared at him, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. She tried to mimic him. Her breath hitched, ragged and shallow. Slower, Ethan instructed, his voice low and grounding, cutting through her panic. "In, hold it, out. Just focus on my voice. Nothing else matters right now. Just my voice." They sat there for 10 minutes, the storm raging against the glass, locked in a rhythm of breathing. Ethan checked his watch every time she grimaced. "I should call an ambulance," Ethan said during a lull. "No ambulance," she managed to say. "The press. If they see an ambulance, the stock price." "Forget the stock price." "Fine. I'm calling Dr. Evans." "Where's your phone?" "Table." Ethan kept one hand on hers and reached back to grab her phone. He dialed the concierge doctor's emergency line, put it on speaker, and explained the situation with clinical precision while rubbing circles on the back of Victoria's hand with his thumb. The doctor promised to be there in 20 minutes, weather permitting. Ethan hung up and looked back at her. The wave had passed, leaving her trembling. She looked small, lost in the oversized furniture. "He's coming," Ethan said. "You're doing great." Victoria looked at the window, where the snow swirled in violent patterns. A fresh tear tracked down her cheek. "I thought about calling David," she whispered. Ethan knew the name. The ex-husband, the one who left when the company started taking up all her time. "But I couldn't," she continued. He wouldn't answer. Or he'd answer, and ask if I was being dramatic. He moved to L.A. with a 20-year-old. He doesn't care about this baby. You don't need him. I do, though. Her voice cracked, breaking into a sob. "I'm not ready, Ethan. Everyone thinks I'm this iron woman, but I'm terrified. I'm going to fail at this. I'm completely alone in this house. If something happens tonight, She squeezed his hand so hard, her fingernails dug into his skin. "I'm so lonely, Ethan. I'm so lonely. It hurts more than the cramps." Ethan moved from his knees to sit on the coffee table, bringing himself level with her. He didn't let go. He leaned in, making sure she saw him, really saw him. "You are not alone," Ethan said. "I am. No. Look at where you are. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. You're my employee. You have to be here. I'm off the clock, Victoria. I'm here because I care about you. And I care about that baby." He softened his grip, covering her hands with both of his. "We are going to get through tonight, and we are going to get through tomorrow. You aren't doing this by yourself anymore." Victoria looked at him. She searched his face for any sign of obligation or pity. She found only steady resolve. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of her isolation lifted just an inch. The doorbell buzzed. "That's Dr. Evans," Ethan said. "I'll let him in." He started to stand up, but Victoria didn't let go of his hand. "Wait. I have to let him in, Victoria. Just come right back. I promise." Ethan sprinted to the door. Dr. Evans, a gray-haired man shaking snow off a heavy coat, bustled in with a medical bag. Ethan led him to the living room. For the next half hour, the penthouse became a makeshift exam room. Ethan stood by the window, giving them privacy, but staying in the room as Victoria requested. He watched the doctor work, watched the tension slowly leave Victoria's shoulders. Finally, Dr. Evans stood up and packed his stethoscope. "It's Braxton Hicks, Victoria. False labor," the doctor said, his tone reassuring. "Combined with extreme stress and dehydration, you've been working too hard. Your body is telling you to stop. So the baby is okay? The baby is fine. But you need rest, real rest. No laptop, no calls, no late nights. And drink water. I'm serious." The doctor gave Ethan a list of instructions and left into the snowy night. The silence returned to the apartment, but the frantic energy was gone. Victoria lay back against the pillows Ethan had arranged for her. She looked exhausted, her hair messy, her face scrubbed clean of the makeup she wore like armor. Ethan walked over with a glass of water. "Drink. Doctor's orders." Victoria took the glass. Her hands were steady now. She drank half of it and set it down. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for panic. For everything I said. Don't apologize. It was unprofessional. We're past professional, Victoria. We're humans. Humans get scared." Ethan picked up the cashmere throw from the back of the sofa, the same one he had covered her with weeks ago, and draped it over her legs. "Try to sleep. I'll stay on the couch tonight. If you need anything, water, help standing up, just say my name." Victoria looked at him. She looked at the makeshift bed he was preparing for himself on the adjacent sofa. She realized she didn't want him to go downstairs. She didn't want the empty space to swallow her again. "Ethan?" He paused, holding a pillow. "Yeah? Thank you. Any time." She closed her eyes. As sleep pulled her under, she realized she wasn't thinking about the spreadsheets or the blizzard or her ex-husband. She was thinking about the rough warmth of Ethan's hand holding hers. And for the first time in 7 months, she felt safe. The blizzard had passed, leaving Chicago buried under a foot of pristine white snow. But the atmosphere inside Sterling Tower was anything but peaceful. Victoria sat behind her massive glass desk, her back straighter than it had been in months. The fear from the night of the storm was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Ethan stood quietly by the door, holding a tablet. He watched her. Since the night at the penthouse, the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just the house manager anymore. He was her silent guard. "Send them in," Victoria said. The double doors opened. Brad Halloway walked in first, strutting like he owned the building. Greg Pinter followed, carrying a stack of bound presentation folders. They both wore eager, predatory smiles. "Good morning, Victoria," Brad said, dropping the formality of Miss. Sterling now that he felt secure in his position. "We have the end-of-year restructuring plan ready. You are going to love the projected savings." "Sit," Victoria said. They took the leather chairs opposite her. Greg handed her a thick folder. "We call it Operation Lean," Brad said, leaning back and crossing his legs. "We did a deep dive into the personnel files across all branches. We identified the redundancies." Victoria opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the list of names on the first page. It was a long list. "Walk me through the criteria," she said. "How did you choose these specific people?" "It's a cost-benefit analysis," Brad explained, waving a hand dismissively. "Take page 3, for example. The warehouse staff in Cicero. Most of them are over 50. Their health insurance premiums are skyrocketing. By cutting them and outsourcing to a third-party agency, we save 40% on benefits alone." Victoria turned to page 3. She saw names: Margaret, Jose, Linda. "And page 5? Victoria asked. "The administrative assistants? Single mothers mostly?" Greg chimed in, trying to be helpful. "They have attendance issues. Kids get sick, they call out. It disrupts the workflow. We need people who are married to the job, not people who leave at 5 p.m. to pick up a toddler." Ethan shifted by the door. His jaw tightened. He knew exactly what it felt like to be on that list. He knew the panic of choosing between a sick child and a paycheck. Victoria didn't look up. She kept turning the pages. "So, we are firing the elderly to save on insurance, and firing mothers to save on productivity." Brad chuckled. "It sounds harsh when you put it that way. I prefer to think of it as trimming the fat. These people are dead weight, Victoria. They are dragging down the bottom line like a tumor. You have to cut it out to let the healthy tissue grow." Victoria stopped moving. Her hand rested on the page. "A tumor." She looked up at Brad. He was smiling, confident, completely detached from the human cost of his spreadsheet. He didn't see people. He saw line items. She thought about the night of the storm. She thought about the terror of being alone in her penthouse, thinking she was losing her baby. She thought about Ethan holding her hand, breathing with her, staying when he didn't have to. Ethan was a single father. He was one of the people Brad called dead weight. And yet, he was the only one who had shown up when she needed help. "You're right, Brad," Victoria said softly. Brad grinned, exchanging a victorious look with Greg. "I knew you'd see it. The executive bonus pool is going to be massive this year with these cuts." "I do see it," Victoria continued. "We need to remove the toxic elements from this company. We cannot have liabilities slowing us down." "Exactly," Brad said. "Clean house. Fresh start for the new year." Victoria reached for the red pen on her desk. She uncapped it. "Operation Lean," she murmured. She drew a thick, red line through the first name on the list. Then the second. She flipped the page and crossed out the entire warehouse team. She flipped again and crossed out the single mothers. Brad frowned, confused. "Victoria? What are you doing?" "Those are the cuts." "I am correcting the list," she said. She flipped to the very last page, the one titled Authorized by. There were 2 names printed there: Brad Halloway, Sales Director, and Greg Pinter, Assistant Director. Victoria circled both names. Then she drew a large X through them. Next to it, she wrote 2 words in bold, jagged letters: Immediate termination. She closed the folder and slid it across the desk toward them. "Here is the approved plan." Brad reached for the folder, his smile faltering. "I don't understand. Did we miss a department?" He opened it. He stared at the red ink crossing out his victims. Then his eyes went to the last page. The color drained from his face. "Is this a joke?" Brad asked. His voice wasn't smooth anymore. It was high and thin. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Victoria asked. "You can't fire us. We just saved you $2 million. You tried to save me money by destroying families," Victoria said. Her voice remained calm, terrifyingly level. "You called human beings tumors. You mocked my house manager for being poor. You represent everything I want Sterling Global to leave behind." Greg started to stammer. "Miss Sterling, I typed what he told me to." "I didn't mean quiet," Victoria commanded. "Your name is on the paper, Greg. You signed it." She pressed the intercom button on her desk. "Sarah, send them in." The side door opened immediately. "Sarah, Victoria's executive assistant, walked in. Behind her were two large men in security uniforms. Brad stood up, his face turning red. "This is insane. I'm the best director you have. You can't do this to me." "It's already done," Victoria said. She pointed to the security guards. "Collect their badges, their phones, their laptops. Escort them out of the building. Do not let them stop at their desks. You'll hear from my lawyer," Brad shouted, pointing a finger at her. "I'll sue you for wrongful termination." Victoria didn't flinch. "Go ahead. Discovery will be fun. I'd love to explain to a jury why you think firing single mothers for having sick children is good business strategy." The guards moved forward. One of them took Brad by the arm. Brad tried to jerk away, but the guard's grip was iron. "Get your hands off me!" Brad yelled. He looked at Ethan, who was still standing silently by the door. You did this! You poisoned her against me!" Ethan didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching. His face was impassive, but his eyes were bright. "Ethan had nothing to do with this," Victoria said, standing up slowly. She rested her hands on the desk. "You did this, Brad. You showed me exactly who you are, and I believed you." She looked at the guards. "Get them out. I don't want to hear another sound." The guards marched them out. Brad was still shouting threats as they dragged him into the hallway, but the heavy soundproof doors swung shut, cutting off his voice instantly. Silence returned to the office. Sarah picked up the red-marked folder. "I'll have HR process the paperwork immediately, Miss Sterling, and I'll shred the layoff list." "Thank you, Sarah. And send a memo to the warehouse team and the support staff. Tell them their jobs are secure. Tell them we are reviewing the benefits package to see if we can lower their premiums." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah smiled, a genuine, relieved smile, and left the room. Victoria sat back down. She let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly against the leather chair. She looked tired, but lighter. Ethan stepped away from the wall. He walked over to the desk and placed a glass of water near her hand. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Victoria looked at the glass, then up at him. "I just fired my top earner," she said. "You just saved your company's soul," Ethan replied. Victoria took a sip of water. She looked at the empty chairs where the bullies had sat just moments ago. "It was quiet," she said. "I thought it would be. Louder." "Justice doesn't have to be loud," Ethan said. "It just has to be right." Victoria smiled faintly. She touched her stomach. "Let's go home, Ethan. I think I've done enough for today. Car is waiting downstairs," he said. He held the door open for her. As she walked past him, she didn't look like the Ice Queen. She just looked like a woman who was finally learning that strength didn't mean crushing others, it meant lifting them up. The quiet drive home from the office that day marked the end of the war. But it took time for the peace to truly settle in. Winter in Chicago eventually gave way to the gray, slushy transition of March. And finally, the tentative green of April. The ice that had coated the city and the penthouse had melted away. 3 months had passed since Victoria reclaimed her company. 3 months since the firing of Brad Holloway. But more importantly, it had been 6 weeks since the night Ethan rushed Victoria to Northwestern Memorial Hospital for the real thing. He had held her hand through 12 hours of labor, fed her ice chips, and cut the cord when a screaming, healthy baby boy named Leo entered the world. Now, on a rainy Saturday afternoon in May, the penthouse didn't look like a museum anymore. The floor-to-ceiling windows were streaked with spring rain, blurring the city skyline into a watercolor of grays and blues. But inside, the air was warm. The sleek gas fireplace, which Victoria used to say was wasteful, was flickering steadily, casting a soft orange glow across the room. The sterile smell of cleaning products was gone, replaced by the scent of a vanilla candle burning on the mantel and the faint, sweet smell of warm milk. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the white rug, the one Lily had been forbidden to touch months ago. He was surrounded by a chaotic explosion of colorful plastic bricks. "No, Daddy, that's a roof piece," Lily said, grabbing a red brick from his hand. "You can't put a roof on the floor. That's silly." "My mistake," Ethan said, holding up his hands in surrender. "I thought we were building a garage for the dragon." "Dragons don't drive cars," Lily stated, with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old. They fly. This is the castle tower. Right. Tower. Got it. Ethan dug through the pile, looking for a window piece. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, his feet bare. His uniform of slacks and button-downs had been abandoned weeks ago. The door to the master bedroom creaked open. Ethan looked up. Victoria stepped out into the living area. She moved softly, her socks padding silently on the hardwood. She was wearing oversized gray sweatpants and a loose cashmere cardigan that swallowed her frame. Her hair, usually pulled back in that severe, tight bun, was loose, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore no makeup. The sharp, terrifying angles of the CEO were gone, replaced by the tired, gentle softness of a new mother. Cradled against her chest was Leo. He was fast asleep, a tiny bundle wrapped in a blue muslin blanket, his face buried in the crook of her neck. Victoria paused by the hallway entrance. She leaned her shoulder against the wall, just watching. She watched Lily bossing Ethan around about the structural integrity of the Lego castle. She watched Ethan laugh, the sound easy and unforced, as he successfully snapped a flag onto the turret. She looked at the room. There was a bouncy chair in the corner, a diaper bag on the entryway table, a half-empty bottle on the coaster where she used to stack her financial reports. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was perfect. Ethan sensed her presence and looked up. His face lit up when he saw them. "Hey," he whispered, keeping his voice low. "He finally went down?" Victoria nodded slowly, careful not to jostle the baby. She walked over to the oversized sectional sofa and sank into the cushions. She let out a long breath, the tension of a sleepless night leaving her shoulders. "It took 40 minutes of rocking," she said softly. "He fights sleep like he thinks he's going to miss a board meeting. He gets that from his mom," Ethan teased. "I don't know what you're talking about. I love sleep. I miss sleep. I fantasize about sleep." Lily looked up from her construction project. "Is Leo awake?" "No, sweetie," Victoria said. "He's dreaming. But you can come look at him if you're quiet." Lily abandoned the Legos and tiptoed over to the couch. She leaned in, staring at the baby's face with fascination. She reached out a finger and very gently touched Leo's tiny hand. "He's so small," Lily whispered. "He's growing fast, though," Ethan said. He stood up, stretching his legs. His knees popped. He walked over and sat on the other end of the sofa, giving Victoria space but staying close. "Do you want me to take him for a bit?" Ethan asked. "You could go lay down, get an hour of real sleep." Victoria looked down at the baby. She brushed her thumb over Leo's ear. "No, I'm okay. I just want to sit here. It's nice." She looked out the window. The rain was picking up, drumming a steady rhythm against the glass. It was the kind of weather that used to make her feel isolated in this tower. Now, it just made the inside feel cozier. "It's raining," Victoria said. "Pouring," Ethan agreed. "Good day for soup. I can start a pot later." Victoria turned her head to look at him. She looked at the man who had been her driver, her house manager, her protector, and now, her family. She looked at Lily, who had gone back to the rug to build a wall for the dragon. She thought about the list of names she had saved. She thought about the empty, cold life she had almost accepted as normal. She shifted Leo to one arm and reached her free hand across the cushion gap. She laid her palm open, waiting. Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, an anchor in the quiet room. "Ethan?" "Yeah?" Victoria squeezed his hand back. Her eyes were bright, shimmering with tears she didn't need to shed. "Thank you," she said, "for not walking away that day in the rain, for stopping, for everything." Ethan looked at her. He looked at the life they had built out of a flat tire and a firing. "I'm never walking away," he said. Victoria smiled. It wasn't a corporate smile. It was real. She leaned her head back against the cushion, closing her eyes, listening to the rain and the click of Lego bricks. The world outside could storm all it wanted. In here, they were safe. And that is our bedtime story for today. How did this ending make you feel? Did watching the ice melt around Victoria's heart bring a sense of warmth to yours? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This story leaves us with a beautiful human lesson. Sometimes, the storms in our lives aren't there to destroy us, but to clear the path for something better. It reminds us that family isn't always defined by blood, but by who shows up and holds your hand when you are most afraid. It is a testament to the quiet, unwavering strength of a single dad who chose kindness over bitterness, even when he had every reason to be angry. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We know how much you cherish these heartwarming single dad stories, where love and integrity ultimately win. I hope you carry this sense of peace and safety with you into your sleep tonight. You are safe, you are valued, and you are not alone. Good night, and sweet dreams.